Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Nelson. I'm in the Communications Department at Biohabitats, and I'd like to welcome you to Habitat Happy Hour. These hours are intended to be a time when we can talk about things related to biodiversity. And today we're happy to present episode 3 of our 3-part webinar series on how we can use ecology as a framework for the planning of resilient, equitable, and biodiverse cities. And here to give that presentation today are Jennifer Dowdell and Eamon Duckworth. Jennifer is a senior ecological planner and designer at Biohabitats, and she is skilled in the integration of ecological principles into site planning and site master planning and design. Eamon Duckworth is a senior landscape architect and urban planner whose expertise is in geospatial modeling and in the evaluation of the services that ecosystems bring to cities. And in episodes 1 and 2, Jennifer and Eamon introduced you to a process that they use to do this work and have used to do this work in cities like Atlanta and Baltimore and in the 9-county region of the Kansas City metropolitan area. They talked about how they learn from and engage community in the process, how they collect and analyze and use data in the process. And today you're going to learn about how they bring it all together in the form of a framework plan and how they really propel that plan into action, into implementation through partnerships and pilot projects. So this is where the really fun part comes in, and I'm looking forward to hearing this presentation. But before I turn it over to Jennifer and Eamon, I just wanted to let all of you know that although you're muted, you can ask a question at any time during Jennifer's talk. Eamon will be answering some of those questions, and then there'll be plenty of time for an open Q&A at the end. The session's being recorded, and in a couple of days, you'll receive an email from me with a link to the recording. And then in a couple of minutes, I'll put links to the recordings for episodes 1 and 2 in the chat window, so you can also check those out. In the handouts tab in your control panel, there are slides, a PDF of the slide deck for today. So you can also download those at any time during the presentation. You probably will not hear from me until we're just about out of time. One quick note, a little heads up at the very end of the webinar, after it ends, you'll receive a survey from me. It's very, very small. And if you can take a minute to complete it, it will really help us improve these Habitat Happy Hours and also make sure that what we're bringing in them is something that is meaningful to you and that you want to talk about. So I really look forward to receiving your feedback. And with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer. Thanks again for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you to all of you who are joining with us today. And we'll get started. So first, we want to take a moment to pause to acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples in a variety of locations around the country. I am coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Susquehannock peoples of the Northern Chesapeake Bay. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and future. Their presence is continual on these lands and waters, and we want to continue to learn and act with respect to the layers of history and the legacy of the original stewards of these lands. So as Amy mentioned, this is the third of 3 episodes that we have brought to you today. Together, we're gathering to really focus on this idea of the urban ecological framework planning process. And all 3 of these sessions, as Amy mentioned, have been or are being recorded. So if you've happened to miss any of them, they'll all be posted in the chat box and available at the Biohabitats website. But today, we're going to really focus on the final episode. What does a living plan mean? And what does it mean to think about implementation and beyond in the urban ecological framework planning approach? So really quickly, before we get started on the presentation, we want to do a quick poll so that we can be familiar with who's joining with us today. If you've participated in the last 2 episodes, these questions will look familiar. They are the same 3 questions, but we want to gauge who's with us and what you're hearing in your home cities or communities and how that can influence our discussion. So Amy, if you could pull up the first poll, please, so that everybody can participate with us in answering this question. So you have 3 options here. to help us understand if you come from the public sector, private sector, or none of the above. So if you could begin answering that question, and we'll give you all a couple moments to complete this, and then we will close it in just a minute. All right, Amy, I think we can close it now. It looks like most folks have participated. So it looks like we have over half of the participants today are in the private sector. A third of the participants are in the public sector. And then we have some folks with nonprofit or none of the above. So thank you all for joining us. I know we've had students in the past join us, and we're always glad to have a wide variety of participants so we can have a rich conversation at the end. The second question is whether or not you're seeing increased interest in resiliency in your communities. So Amy, if you could post the second question. This is just a yes or no question, so we can understand what you're hearing from your constituents, colleagues, or local towns and councils. And I think we can close that poll. That was a quickie. 100% yes. So everyone is seeing increased interest in resiliency, which is what we're hearing as well. So that's great. And the final question, Amy, if you could post that for everyone to participate. We want to know, what is the top priority defining your local planning work? And while all of these may be of interest in your communities, we just want you to choose the top priority so we can see kind of the wide variety of priorities that we might be experiencing in different communities across the country and beyond around the world. So we'll give you all another minute to complete this final poll question. It looks like we've got almost everyone participating. So I think, Amy, we can go ahead and close that poll, and let's see what our results are. Almost half of you see an interest or a top priority in environmental sustainability and conservation, but there's also a fair amount of interest in equity and access and economic redevelopment. And I think what's really interesting about that is that those three are the top three that come out in a lot of the requests for proposals we see in new community planning work. But all of these topics are really interrelated in this approach and in a lot of what we're seeing as priorities across the community. So thank you all for participating in that poll. It's always great to hear from you, and we'll try to keep that in mind as we walk through this presentation of information. So this session, episode 3, is really focused on the final implementation of these planning projects and understanding what goes into encompassing that. But first, I'm going to just briefly touch on what we covered in episodes 1 and 2. But when we're thinking about implementation in this final plan and the final push to complete a plan, one thing our clients frequently mention to us is that they don't want another plan that just sits on a shelf, that the plans should be successful if they are actionable. And we hear that a lot. I think anybody who works in planning hears that a lot from our clients or in our communities, that we don't want another plan. There's so many plans that have been done over decades. And many of us doing planning work also recognize that there's a fair amount of fatigue in the community associated with planning and planning projects and public participation and engagement. And we want to be sensitive to that. And we know that a lot of these community members are almost annually being asked to participate in these planning events or planning processes. And so we have endeavored, in working with our clients, they both prioritize the importance of making sure these plans were actionable. And not only were they actionable, but that the first actions actually took place during the planning process, so that we were actually starting to lay the groundwork for implementation while we are still finalizing the plans. So we'll see that a little bit today in the examples that we share in our work. Just to quickly review, we have developed and are continuing to refine and evolve a 6-step iterative planning process for really thinking of this socio-ecological approach to urban planning. So in the first session, we really focused on the first 2 steps. The second session that we presented a couple weeks ago, we focused on these center 2 steps. And today, again, I'll focus on the last 2 steps. But again, this is iterative. It's very much oriented towards feedback loops. So while we do go chronologically, we also refer back to a lot of the earlier steps to really enrich the overall planning process. So in session 1, just to quickly recap, we really started to understand and lay the foundation for what a socio-ecological approach to systems thinking and planning is. And these three parts of that, of ecology, biodiversity, and community. And it was this idea of interweaving community and stakeholder knowledge and desires with ecological foundations of a functional landscape in the urban context. And why? Why are we trying to do this? Well, over half of the world's population lives in cities or will in the next couple of decades, and cities concentrate people and resources. And so these are the places where there's this most dynamic environment of intersection of nature and community. So we see this great potential. We understand that more than a quarter of all endangered or critically endangered species will be affected by urban expansion. So what we do and how we design our cities for the future matters in so many ways and in so many contexts for all life to thrive and for all of us to better understand our connection to nature. So in session one, we really focused on highlighting the integrated approach of gathering and using community input from our initial project kickoff to the very end, collecting these narratives of place and community's identity with nature and weaving that throughout our process. And we would map this input and use it in a way that it could be geospatially utilized in our analysis and synthesis and in the development of these urban ecological frameworks or green network plans. Also key in that first session was highlighting that we strive for collaborative partnerships with our clients, who are often planning agencies or departments or offices of sustainability and resilience at the city scale, and that we are also cultivating this multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach to teaming that engages designers, landscape ecologists, scientists of various backgrounds, economic development specialists, transportation planners, and nonprofit organizations. And we're going to come back to that at the end of this conversation today because of the importance of that nonprofit role in thinking about future implementation. In session two, our last session, Eamon focused on our approach to integrating the data analysis and use of geospatial tools to process these questions associated with habitat, biodiversity, ecosystem services, parks and open space access, and social vulnerability and climate justice. And we are considering a dynamic representation of nature in our cities as we develop our data analysis and the spectrum of function and what that means in the city scale. So Eamon shared and walked through our process of developing measures of habitat and biodiversity at the city scale. He also showed our process for really exploring what understanding the interior forest and habitat connectivity potential in a city is, and bringing principles of landscape ecology into the geospatial realm for our analysis of the city's resources. And then, of course, importantly, we compared the natural resources to the social vulnerability statistics of these cities and the communities to highlight areas that we could address equity and environmental justice. So today, we're really going to dive into the final framework. What are the final plan components in our work both in Baltimore City and in Atlanta? So first here is the final plan and document cover for the Baltimore Green Network Plan. Our client was the Baltimore City Department of Planning under the leadership of now retired Director Tom Stosser. And our teammates, our consulting team included Flora Teeter landscape architects, tool design, advanced placemaking, and living design labs. And it was a very collaborative team process through the entirety of the project. Now, we've gone over this in previous sessions, but just to review, in looking at understanding the potential of establishing a green network across the city of Atlanta, we looked at a lot of data, including the natural resources, the historic planning, the social implications of past activities like redlining, what was data available for livability and community feedback that we could integrate, as well as research components for those things that had been studied in the past. We also considered a variety of different elements in looking at the prioritization of potential across the city using least cost path analysis and gap analysis. And this vision plan began to emerge as a network of nodes and corridors that could strengthen connections between and within communities across the city, to park space, and across various scales of habitat and urban ecological function in the city of Baltimore. Throughout this process, the community was able to express their concerns and needs honestly and openly. And two issues that came up throughout the process at a variety of occasions when we would meet with communities and present our process and the data that we had been developing and gathering from them, we heard uniformly that there was concern about lack of resources in the city to take care of new parks and open space. We already have parks. They're not always necessarily managed as we might hope, sometimes the community members mentioned. And there was also this desire for more jobs and educational opportunities, not just more green space. And so we worked with the city and we listened to those comments, and we were able to develop further recommendations that could address some of those big concerns. We worked with the city to develop recommendations for how green infrastructure concepts could accommodate other new training or employment practices. And we even connected City of Baltimore staff with City of Philadelphia staff who had just recently created a new job training program for communities who were caring for new green vacant lots across the city of Philadelphia. So we were able to start to make some connections and develop some new opportunities. And Baltimore City ran with that and has their own program now that helps kind of connect green jobs development in the city of Baltimore with the care and management of some of the vacant lots that are now green spaces across the city. We also made sure to continue to engage with the community and hear their desires, understand the aesthetics they were looking for, and really try to map out their needs in the city. And that really ended with this final plan, which is a series of nodes and corridors across the city to create the network. The nodes are these open space, green destinations for people and nature to meet. And the corridors are linear spaces that provide safe, comfortable movement within and between the nodes and the neighborhoods for both humans and wildlife. So I'll briefly go into a little bit further definition of the corridors and nodes so you can get a sense of how that started to become the green network for the city. Community corridors provide safe and comfortable connections primarily for people. So they're the light brown line in this map here. And then the nature corridors were those that provide vital haven for wildlife and the health of our ecosystems along rivers. Now, important to the corridors plan for Baltimore City and important to the implementation was this existing plan for a 35-mile loop, a rails to trails program around the city that could connect communities. And so we built on that and integrated that into the Green Network plan. And that added approximately 12 miles of connecting walking and bicycling paths to create this 35-mile loop that would continue to connect neighbors. Excuse me, some of this loop had already been built and the rest of it hadn't, so this allowed for this loop to continue to have a presence in people's mind's eyes for the future of the city. Now, the community corridors or people-focused corridors were intended to make for safer connections for residents who walk or bike to schools, to parks, to stores, to recreation centers, and more. Excuse me. And that also included the rails to trails loop. The nature corridors really started to highlight and identify these stream valleys, the Jones Falls, the Herring Run, the Gwynns Falls stream valleys that create the sense of connection to nature across the city. And the corridors were established to help support the health of our streams, the Inner Harbor, the Lower Patapsco River, and the Chesapeake Bay, and create that haven for wildlife in the city and protect those areas. There were 3 different types of nodes established in the Green Network Plan. Community nodes that offered green open spaces and amenities integrated into established neighborhood fabric. Nature nodes that were these natural spaces characterized for ecological function. And anchor institution nodes or existing open space nodes. And these were significant and important, the existing open space nodes. because these included those spaces already with city parks, universities, cemeteries, hospitals, etc. These, in many cases, were private landholders that could manage their sites for ecological function as well as educational stewardship and healthy living, and they could be important catalysts for economic investment and revitalization. The community nodes, and there were 3 different types of community nodes, included those areas for neighborhood revitalization and integrated open space, different spaces for parks and open space enhancement where there already was open space, and habitat-sensitive parks and recreation. So those areas, those are the dots circled in red, where there's the opportunity to integrate open space access with increased habitat value to provide spaces for recreation, greening, and other amenities to support the neighborhood fabric and local real estate markets. Finally, the nature nodes had 3 different types of nature nodes, and they were locations for enhancing and expanding habitat in forest patches, in floodplains, and wetlands near nature corridors. And they could provide stepping stones, habitat stepping stones for wildlife that could move across the city. So through this process, we also were working on developing and digging deeper into 4 specific pilot areas or focus areas where the city could dig in deeper and to develop more design concepts at the scale of the focus areas in neighborhoods. And this was all led really by the leadership of the planning department's community liaisons. They guided a community-based design approach to help develop these design concepts at the site and block scale. And our team really acted as support to them in this process, so that there was this constant relationship that they had developed over many years that was the foundation for these deeper dive discussions with neighborhoods and community leaders to help develop these community-based designs that were specific to the needs, but we're also integrating the different goals associated with the Green Network Plan of increasing urban habitat, providing opportunities for green infrastructure and best management practices of stormwater, but also addressing environmental injustices and addressing specific ideas that the community wanted implemented. So one of those examples was in the Southwest focus area, and so here's a map of that detailed design. So city planning staff developed this more detailed focus area plan and identified specific parcels for pilot projects to detail out design. And the idea was that the design and implementation plan was begun even before our Green Network Plan, the holistic citywide plan, had been completed. And this showed that intention for real action and implementation that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. So we're going to focus on this first location of one of the pilot projects. This is a vacant parcel of land, fairly small, in the Boyd Booth neighborhood. And this is in Southwest Baltimore. And the intention was this to be a memorial park in honor of Rachel Wilson, the first female firefighter who passed away in the city of Baltimore during a tragedy accident. And she passed away on this location while fighting a fire that they had created as a training project. And so the intention that the neighborhood addressed and brought to the attention of the community liaisons was that they wanted this to be a playground space and a garden and a space to memorialize and remember Rachel Wilson. And so this project, this idea, started with some very loose concept renderings that we developed to help kind of just get it off its feet. And then the city Department of Planning moved it forward fairly quickly, working with the Neighborhood Design Center, a local nonprofit landscape architecture and architecture group, to help develop a more detailed concept of the design for this garden and park. The city planning department worked with the Housing and Community Development Agency and the Baltimore City Parks and Rec and Park to move this forward. And they identified a series of neighborhood and community partners who would help implement this plan, and that included Rachel Wilson's family, the Boyd Booth Community Association, the Neighborhood Design Center, the African American Firefighter Association, and Bon Secours Medical System, who has locations close to this park, and their community engagement officer. So during the process of the year when we were completing our plan, the Neighborhood Design Center moved the design forward and put together this much more detailed concept plan for the park, including just what you see in the red outline of the first phase of implementation. That was then developed into a finalized plan, which is currently starting construction on the site. And just at the end of 2019, The memorial mural was completed at the edge of the site. And this begins this process of really engaging with the community. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, the Baltimore firefighters local have even posted photos on social media of the progress on the site of this park being built. And so our plan was completed a little bit before some of these initial steps were completed, but the process had been started before the Green Network Plan had even finished. We had, during the Green Network planning process, completed similar concepts or renderings for potential concepts at 2 other locations in the city. This one in Druid Square in the Druid Heights neighborhood, which also integrated a playground as specified by the neighborhood community needs community association, and Smithson Park. In the Sandtown Winchester neighborhood, again, a rendering of a concept that includes all of the specified needs, activities, and spaces that the neighborhood wanted to identify for the future design. And by the end of our Green Network planning process, 1/3 of the funding had been accounted for before our plan was even finished. So the city had started to put together a funding plan to help start this implementation process. So now the other final plan that we wanted to share with you today is our work in the city of Atlanta. Here you see the final plan on the right-hand side of the screen and the cover of the final report on the left. This plan was completed last year under the leadership of Planning Commissioner Tim Keene with the City of Atlanta Department of Planning. And our team, our consultant team, included Perez Planning and Design, Planners for Environmental Quality, American Forest, the Conservation Fund, also Planning and Design, and Cooper Carey. So a wide variety of practitioners, both private practice and nonprofit organizations. In the case of Atlanta City Design Nature, there were 5 elements or 5 layers that make up the final plan. So the first 3 are designed for wildness, which is focused on these 2 major park areas accessible to the community of large park areas, many with forest or other natural resource to help preserve and protect these large areas of nature. The second part was designed for comfort, and this is to support the continued and strengthened ecosystem services, the lungs of the city identified through our biodiversity and habitat evaluation, focusing on highlighting those areas for future protection and conservation measures. And then designed for retreat and adventure, the third on the right here, is helping to outline the escape routes to nature, as they named them, or increasing access to nature in a variety of ways across the city, either on greenways or blueways on the stream, so that city open space is accessible to all. The second, the final 2 layers of that 5 layers are designed for connections, which here is helping connect communities to nature and along corridors and at open space patches, and designed for lifestyles that highlights 3 particular growth areas that have been identified previous to our work, where an ecological design approach to new development could really shape these areas to understand and respect the high biodiversity and habitat value that we had found there, but allow for this beautiful new approach to economic or population growth that also embraces ecology as a central feature. So what was also important in the Atlanta work is that this work was the foundation for the cities wanting to inform the development of an update to the tree ordinance in the city of Atlanta. So this plan and the results of the data analysis that we developed during this planning process really helped lay the groundwork and understand the ideas of what could be preserved and protected in the new tree ordinance. So we have this couple maps from what Eamon showed last time of protection priorities, restoration priorities, and tree canopy goals for across the city, and that could help inform the tree ordinance. And we're excited to share that just recently, the City of Atlanta just published their updated tree protection ordinance. This has just been released, and it is the new ordinance that was done as we were completing the city design nature planning process. So it has been rolled out, and you'll see that there are opportunities throughout this that highlight the results that were found during the planning process. So there's a direct connection between policy and implementation and policy and the Green Network planning process. Also, interesting and I think really promising for the city of Atlanta and other major metropolitan areas is the opportunities that they have to partner with nonprofit organizations like the Conservation Fund, who is a member of our planning team for the work in Atlanta, but who has this wonderful program called Parks with Purpose. They have completed many projects across the city and protected hundreds of acres throughout the Atlanta metro region. But really excitingly, Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve is a new preserve. It is one of the first green space acquisitions that was funded through the city's tree protection ordinance that has been modified recently. And this allows for the protection of 216 acres of natural areas, 60,000 trees in one of the areas around the South River watershed, which is one of the focus watersheds in our project work. And so the Conservation Fund is actively continuing to help preserve and protect these natural resources across the city and continue to open up access in a variety of ways to community members who may not have had as much access to green space in the past. So we see a variety of ways that these plans are starting to be living plans that have actions associated with them in real time. The final thing I wanted to touch on today in our discussion is funding approaches. Both Baltimore City and the City of Atlanta planning staff put a lot of thought into how they would fund the implementation of these new plans, this approach to socio-ecological planning framework, and they both have chapters in the report that focus on the funding mechanisms, the possibility for funding and how that leads to action. And what's really exciting is that in the case of Baltimore City, after the plan was completed and approved by the mayor and the city planning commission, that the Green Network was able to have a new staff member appointed within the city planning department that would their sole responsibility would be to support the Green Network plan fully implementation into the future. So there is a Green Network staff position now within the City of Baltimore, which is really exciting and a great way to see that they will continue to live up to this idea of implementation and action. So very briefly, as I wrap up for today, again, this is the 6-step iterative process that we have gone through over the last 3 episodes, over the last month with all of you who've joined us. And it is really this iterative feedback loop of understanding community needs and ecological foundation in thinking of how to strengthen and create a resilient city for the future. So we have this list of resources that give you links to all these final plans that I've shown and shared with you and that we've shared over the last 3 sessions. It also has a link to that new tree protection ordinance if you're interested to see how Atlanta made that a reality. And with that, I'll wrap it up so that we can have some time for discussion and questions. So I think Eamon is going to be taking a look at the questions that have been posted. If you have any, please feel free to post them and we can answer them, Eamon and I together. And then Eamon, if you have any, you can go ahead and share. I'll be happy to start.
Sure. I'm interested. We talked a little bit about reviewing a little bit about kind of what was presented in the full suite of the webinars that we've given here now in the 3rd part with the implementation piece. And I'm wondering if you want to discuss any other models or approaches, kind of overarching frameworks to approach this topic of urban ecological planning. You know, have your thoughts on those models that have met with some success or that might be kind of newer and more interesting or innovative?
Sure, yeah. There's one model in particular that I've been keeping an eye on and reading about over the last 12 months. It's called the donut model. It was developed by Kate Raworth, and it is what she calls it's the understanding the donut of planetary boundaries and social boundaries and sort of where we fit within what the capacity of the earth is and what the needs of the community are. And so I see a lot of parallels with our work and with a lot of what is going on across the nation and around the globe in terms of sustainability planning and kind of green network planning. And I think there's a lot more to learn from that work. Initially, I think she was thinking of it at the larger scale than a city. She has a great book about it. But then I think also there have been she's done a couple projects where she applies it at the city scale. I think there's maybe in Amsterdam, I think she has developed a donut model approach to looking at Amsterdam and progressive kind of resiliency planning for the future. And I believe her group has also been looking at Portland, Oregon, and trying to apply the donut model there. But I think it's a fascinating model that we would all benefit from learning more about.
Great, and maybe potentially building on that question, can you remind us of some of the international examples? We're been a little more focused on some US-based projects, and we're all certainly more familiar and active within the country here, but perhaps some of the international examples you shared previously might be worth taking note of.
Absolutely, yes. In session one, we talked very briefly about some of the other models that we had become aware of either while we were working on the Green Network Plan or as we were developing further precedent research for our work in Atlanta. And amongst those, we saw some really great work coming out of Barcelona, Spain, and also Hamburg, Germany, and Edmonton, Canada, the Breathe project out of Edmonton. And all three projects were really interesting, kind of taking slightly different approaches, but trying to integrate more about natural systems and this natural framework or skeleton that you can build city planning processes on. And I think there were some really interesting examples, and it was great to see how they thought of their natural resource areas as connected to communities. So I think all three of those examples, and there are a couple others I mentioned, I believe, but those are the top three.
And then maybe a couple questions related to community input and community needs. Can you talk a little bit about any of the kind of the specific programming needs or desires that you heard from some of the community and creating specific green spaces in their neighborhoods?
Absolutely. Yeah, we were trying to be very sensitive to that throughout the process. And I think one of the things we heard a fair amount in Baltimore in some of the neighborhoods was this need for safe spaces for small children to play, specifically kind of toddler to through elementary school, and in a space that could accommodate those small children as well as space for their caregivers, whether it's grandparents or parents who are taking their kids to the park. So it was this mix of what the child could want and need and what an adult would want in terms of a social space or a gathering space. So we were very sensitive to that and heard that actually a couple times throughout the process, that was very specific, this idea of spaces for small children, a safe space, a space that accommodated their desire for play and wonder and engagement in nature. I think other than that, I already mentioned the job creation. We also had, some folks, I think in both places, in Atlanta and in Baltimore, there is a concern, a genuine concern, a real concern about the implications of creating these new vibrant green spaces that might impact the existing community with regard to gentrification. And I think we were all very grateful for that question to be brought up and to be posed to us, our team, and the city planning department staff. We needed to hear it, to be reminded of those concerns. They are real concerns. Some cities have experienced this, where you have these new green infrastructure practices, these big water features come in, and it increases the property value and puts a tax burden on the existing community members. And what we want to do is try to avoid displacement. We want to help strengthen these communities, ensure they can stay in these spaces and really enjoy the amenities that are built in with the addition of the Green Network planning process. So we talked a lot about that, and there was a lot of discussion about that in Atlanta, and there were technical advisory committee members on our technical advisory kind of group that we met with regularly to help talk through different financial support mechanisms, or other types of opportunities to support these communities to avoid displacement. But it was a real conversation piece that we were grateful to have brought up so that we could talk about it and really address it meaningfully.
Yeah, that actually directly connects, and maybe you already covered a little bit about the other topic, but asking about green gentrification. Maybe I'll add that there's been a kind of increasing research on this topic of anti-displacement strategies. I think in many ways they might go beyond what might be the direct purview of what the the RFP or the specific focus of the plan, or even the specific focus of the client entity that some of these that might be leading some of these plans. But I think there's a good body of research that's continuing to develop, how we can increase the equity and democracy in our access to ecological systems and community visions, without displacing and causing harm while these plans may be intending to do good. And I think maybe just in summary, the kind of the research of success from case studies that I've seen from some other cities in the U.S. are kind of making that commitment for anti-displacement and strategies to against green gentrification and negative change to communities early in the process, and then setting up perhaps new structures or new programs or new initiatives within some of these planning departments to make sure that, as the plan is implemented, that carries throughout the life of the plan and moving forward. But I think a really important topic that some continued research will certainly be beneficial to all of these kind of plans. I have a question here about asking about as landscape architects. I'll add, many of the folks on our team are multidisciplinary folks, landscape architects, ecological planners, engineers and ecologists, multidisciplinary teams, but also some multidisciplinary individuals. So the question is, asking as landscape architects, can you comment on the level of interdisciplinary collaboration used in this process at Biohabitats? Were there any skills for the planning process that were outsourced, or do you feel like these skills are accessible to the majority of conventional landscape architecture professionals? They simply need to plug into them. Do you feel the scarcity of such mindful planning a cause for the professionals or from the clients? So maybe is the scarcity of mindful planning related to professional expertise or activity, or perhaps related to the client end? So maybe a couple multi-question, multi-topic question in that one, but maybe to kind of go back first, talking about the interdisciplinary collaboration and forming those teams to meet the needs of the project.
Sure. Well, I think Biohabitats, we are spoiled in that we are an interdisciplinary design firm that has on our staff environmental scientists, ecologists of varying areas of expertise, landscape architects, engineers, and urban planners or urban designers. And I think we understand the benefit and the kind of absolute joy of working internally to Biohabitats, and we try to apply that too in all of the planning work and design and other types of work that we do in creating teams that also reach out to those areas of expertise or practice areas that we don't have represented on our internal staff. And we find that there's such a gift to those dialogues that become of those opportunities to work together. So we're very intentional, of course, of reading the RFP and the requirements of the city planning department, trying to learn a little bit more about what has happened in the city before us in terms of planning work, and how that has been evolving to get to where they are looking for an integrated kind of holistic approach that allows for ecology to have a significant role. And then we try to find those other practitioners to help add to our work. So of course, I'm trained as a landscape architect, but I'm more focused in the area of ecology and ecological planning and ecological design. So we have always partnered with local landscape architects in our city planning work, so that we are on the ground in those cities, even if I may not physically be on the ground, to have that expertise that is specific to those communities, and also has more experience in a variety of landscape architectural projects and backgrounds. And then of course we include urban designers, engineers occasionally if it warrants it on the project, economic development specialist. We actually hired for Baltimore City someone who specializes in economic and redevelopment opportunities in the city to really try to weave that conversation in throughout the process. Transportation planners, so really specifically understanding the opportunities that can be made for improving our roads and creating a greenway or a network that is safe for users of a variety of different ability levels. So transportation planners, I think, have been really important in the dialogues that we've had. And we've been able to work with two really great firms who bring that expertise and that long experience of working in cities. And then, of course, I mentioned nonprofits. So we don't have all of that expertise, but we understand the value of these rich conversations that can be had when all of these heads are looking at and thinking about these issues together. And then I think I mentioned in the previous session, we see the opportunity to have our client relationship really be a collaborative relationship where we feel we are partners, we can speak openly and have really rich dialogue with the city planning departments or Office of Resilience or Office of Sustainability, so that we're all working together and really moving these forward to support the communities. I can't remember the end part of that question.
So maybe the next part was, asking about, are these skills accessible to the majority of conventional landscape architecture professionals? So maybe making a little bit of a categorization about maybe what might be more typical landscape architecture work, but versus potentially the more urban ecological focused work. And then, is the scarcity of some of this urban ecological planning, potentially based on what professionals are bringing or what the clients are, client direction or focus?
Sure. I think it's probably more of the latter. So I think there's a lot of evolution happening right now as climate change becomes center to a lot of community thinking for planning for a more resilient, more healthy, more safe future for their populations. And with that, there's been further interest in understanding the role of ecosystem services, and that has become more common in parlance across many organizations and agencies to think about ecosystem services. So I think that's actually an evolution of thought has occurring nationally, so that there is now more attention on the opportunity to see ecology woven in more explicitly or allow that to be the foundation for this work. I do think that, it's hard to make a judgment about what conventional landscape architecture is. I think the profession has evolved a lot over the last couple of decades. And always, I think, landscape and the function of landscape has been central to our training, but there have been more and more specialized trainings and sort of focused programs that provide ecology as a foundation for learning the practice of landscape architecture. And I think we're seeing more and more programs that offer that. And therefore, we have more and more landscape architects graduating from programs where there's more focus on ecology. So we're continuing to evolve as a profession. Some of us, I think, focus on that in our studies because that was our passion and we wanted to start with ecology. But I believe that is an evolving thing for many practitioners, and many of us have been using it at varying degrees. But now there is this common consciousness across many communities that is asking for it. And so it's allowing for us to dive deeper. And I think many of us are very excited about that. And we at Biohabitats are frequently, almost always, collaborating with landscape architecture firms that may have a broader focus, but want to continue to kind of evolve and grow this focus on ecology. And I think we love collaborating with a variety of landscape architecture firms and architecture firms on these projects.
Yeah, and I think I'll add, the idea of an urban ecological framework plan and all that covers in that full process. It's it's a bit of a unique plan approach, but what I am seeing is that different regions or different municipalities may have some very specific drivers that's driving their needs for planning. It may be water scarcity, it may be an abundance of water and flooding issues, exacerbated by climate change. There may be a municipality that's just very focused on their tree canopy and maximizing the preservation and expansion of that. And I think what we've been working on, with every project is to, if there is this more narrow focus that might be more potentially defined as conventional, that we're bringing some more innovative, holistic thinking to that. And if there is a specific driver, that we're still considering the fuller picture of the ecology of the city, and kind of expanding those themes and interactions as much as feasible within those projects. And potentially teeing up, additional expansion of that in future phases. But, I think regardless of whatever the theme, or maybe the more traditional plan might be, every city has a parks plan. I think there's ways to approach them to make them more ecologically focused, or make them more focused on the full urban ecology of this city.
Absolutely. And like the parks plans, there are opportunities in general transportation plans, in comprehensive plans, in water infrastructure plans to have an ecology layer that helps kind of speak to this holistic approach.
Yeah, so a couple more here. I think we'll have time for them.
Okay.
This one's asking about the pedagogical steps that we needed to go through to kind of inform and city employees of ecological design and benefits. Was there any pushback, from some people that were part of the process that maybe didn't agree with the process, or some of the priorities that the plan was trying to promote?
I don't think it was pushback per se. Definitely, we had rich conversations to help sort of guide broader understanding of, say, ecological principles or landscape ecology principles that we sort of bring to the table with our approach to kind of thinking about data analysis. I think there were lots of questions and a lot of really interesting growth and I remember an example in Atlanta where the city planning project manager actually presented our work at one session. And so she was actually kind of then sharing that information and that perspective of the ecological overlay or undergirding impacts to the public. So I think it was really nice to have that dialogue and to sort of share. But definitely there is learning, but I think that goes both ways. Because we at the same time are continuing to learn and understand the community, the very specific and unique personalities, and the very specific needs and desires, fears, and considerations that one needs to take in thinking about community planning at the city scale. So it's both ways for sure. In that, I don't recall any specific pushback. We were always trying to make sure that the guiding principles were what the community had identified and that the city planning department had established. We would, of course, ask or, suggest tweaks perhaps to language to help increase the use of terminology, because we don't think it should, we want to be careful not to be using lots of jargon, but we also want to continue to kind of expand the vocabulary and the knowledge of ecosystem services and ecology and function.
Great. We've got a multi-part question here, also related to developers and private landowners. That traditional greenfield developers are focused on maximizing housing units, not necessarily protecting green spaces, etc. So maybe what are some best practices to encourage or require developers to protect forested areas within these networks?
So the city of Atlanta actually was a really good example of this. From the beginning, one of the driving features that started the discussion of creating this nature strategy was this increased population growth that was going to be massive in the metro area and Atlanta proper. And so developers had been part of the conversation from the very beginning and were integrated throughout in a variety of the meetings that were scheduled to talk through this process, so that we could have them at the table to hear their concerns, address those concerns when it relates to sort of what they might perceive as impact to their plans for the future. But I think it was really good to just have them at the table to sort of talk through that and hear from them. We had a couple developers who attended a number of the community meetings so that they could sort of hear what the community wanted and could also ask their own questions and kind of voice some of their concerns. You know, there's a lot of interesting innovations that have occurred over the years with regard to new development and how to cluster development on parcels so that you can try to protect as much of the existing open space or natural area as possible, to kind of give buffers to the natural resources like your streams or your interior forests, and allow for there to be kind of a transition zone between the built footprint and the space that's being protected. It does, you know, it provides an opening for developers to think creatively and maybe think strategically about the types of buyers they're looking for, or users who will then be in those spaces after they've been developed. But I think we had a lot of rich discussions with developers who were involved in the process of the planning in Atlanta. And don't recall a lot of really negative interactions. It was more a very open discussion, and the lifestyle layer that we then detailed out a little bit. If you look in that chapter in the Atlanta City Design Nature book, there is some really interesting, we gave design recommendations for kind of site scale or a series of parcels, and the types of design, kind of ecological design guidelines that could help guide development on this parcel. So we weren't saying no development. We were saying we recognize there will be development. What we want to do is preserve and protect some of our highest value resource, and also create a space that is facing it, that is embracing it, that's celebrating it, and allowing for the development to build on that concept.
Great. There's a question here related to the Atlanta project, and you know, we mentioned that it informed the tree protection ordinance, and then asking, you know, how it might inform other city policies as it relates to the topics of the plan.
Sure. I don't exactly know where all of these are right now, but at the time that we started the Atlanta process, really focused on the nature element, City of Atlanta had developed this amazing overarching guidance document called Atlanta City Design. That was this holistic, comprehensive plan for the city. And there were other elements in that plan, or other sort of priorities. And one of those was transportation planning. I believe one was looking at zoning and what does kind of enhanced or improved zoning look like. And so those are kind of parallel projects. And I think one thing that we considered during the process of developing the ecological framework that became Atlanta City Design Nature was how the work that we had done might potentially impact future zoning or ordinance updates and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of potential for there to be different ways that different policies, in whatever kind of process they are, can start to reflect some of the potential nuances of the Green Network Plan in the city context. So those were happening. I don't know, to be honest with you, where they are in their processes with those, but I believe the transportation plan was completed right before we started ours. So we were kind of aware of that in the background. We were also very aware of their keeping track of their city tree canopy, and we were able to kind of increase our knowledge and the potential for our analysis through keeping updated on tree canopy coverage, data analysis, and gathering. And I think we're seeing that in cities around the country, that there are these parallel efforts. But as long as there are people at the city planning agencies who can help kind of bridge all the different agencies, and we had a lot of that in both Atlanta and Baltimore, where other agencies had representatives at the table frequently, so we could talk about how there were cross-cutting impacts or opportunities.
Yeah, I think we heard, you know, in some ways these plans themselves can be a tool for agencies and their projects that don't necessarily always have the opportunity or the regular practice of cross collaborating. I know we heard, you know, from folks in watershed management very interested in understanding, well, how can their projects that might be focused, you know, very focused on stormwater, you know, how could they take shape, or where could they be prioritized to help meet some of the other priorities that were outlined in the urban ecology framework. And I'd say, you know, the plan outlines the framework and the vision with some very specific detail for some specific sites. And then I'd consider the policy, kind of the menu of tools that, if we're gonna have to wrap up here, so I can't go into too far with them, but there are a number of policy recommendations in the Atlanta City Design Nature, the tree protection ordinance, which is keyed up, and then to folding some of these priorities into the zoning ordinance. So we kind of went through the different aspects of, well, here are the tools of how the city operates from a policy standpoint, and then here's kind of these key points where the vision and the priorities of the framework for the city could be integrated. So I think it's I think it takes the full menu of tools, both regulatory and more informal initiatives or focuses of individuals within the departments to really bring all of these visions to reality.
So sorry to interrupt such an interesting discussion, but it is time for us to wrap up. Jennifer and Eamon, thank you so much. It was a great presentation, really exciting to see how the plan begins to translate to action. Thank all of you for the great questions and for joining us today. I hope to see you back at Habitat Happy Hour, and normally I'll put in some kind of plug for something we have coming up, but instead of doing that, I'd rather just put in a plug and just remind everyone that June 5th is World Environment Day, and it is the official launch of what the UN has declared to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. So I just encourage everyone to support ecological restoration in any way that you can, get involved, and join us because we've got so much work to do. Thank you all for joining us. You'll receive a follow-up email from me with a link to the video and any other details that we weren't able to address in the time that we had. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.